Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be speaking about the withdrawal of the Russia's Brigade troops, formerly Wagner Group or Africa Corp, from the Sahel region. I'm joined by an important guest, which is now like our regular guest, Fidel Amakye Owusu. Fidel is an international relations and security analyst. He's a geopolitical and security advisor at Riley Riggs and the CEO at DevSec Analytics Africa Limited, amongst other roles. I'm glad to host you for the second time. I enjoyed your first appearance where we discussed the Niger-US military cooperation break-off. Since then, there have been other new developments, including the withdrawal of the Russian troops from the Sahel region that we're going to be talking today. So I look forward to a very great conversation with you.
Yeah, I same here, sir, and I appreciate your time and opportunity.
Brilliant. So let's start off. So there's been, I don't know if this is confirmed now, but you able to confirm to us. There's been talk that Russia is withdrawing troops from the Sahel region to bolster its fight in Ukraine. How true is this, and what are the factors that have led to Russia taking this decision?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Firstly, it's not a total withdrawal of forces, but it is some withdrawal in especially Burkina Faso, where a quasi military group known as the Bear Group from Russia was stationed. And in fact, this was a 300 strong contingent that was based in Burkina Faso to help fight extremism and to help protect the regime, as we have seen in recent years and months. And after the Ukraine's offensive in the Kursk Oblast in Russia, it looked like it was not expected. And so we saw some forces in the east of Ukraine, Russian forces in the east of Ukraine, being withdrawn to help create a good or an effective counter against Ukrainian forces who are currently in Russian territory. The significant thing is that this is the first time since the Second World War that Russia has been officially invaded. And so it's very significant, despite what we see to be Kremlin communication strategy to, water down the effect of the whole situation. It is really a big deal. And so this has led to some rethink or some change in strategy in the overall Russian war strategy. And as a result, some forces in other theaters, including those in Syria, Africa, are being withdrawn to help re-strategize and perhaps repel Ukrainian forces in Russia. And so eventually we had the Bear Group leader stating clearly that he was withdrawing 100 people out of the 300 in order to help this. Before that, we also saw that Wagner forces in Mali, there were news that some of them were withdrawing to help with this particular agenda of Moscow. And so that has been the reason for such withdrawal. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. There's also been a question. I don't know how true this is. I know you've mentioned the fight in Russia-Ukraine fight and how the tide against the Russian it's leading to this. But another factor that I've heard or read about it, that the Russian troops in the Sahel have also suffered some significant attack from jihadists, and this could also be how can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's true. If there has been bad days for Russian troops in the Sahel, then it's been the last few weeks. In fact, the wind is currently in the sails of extremists and rebels who are acting separately. This is very important because then sometimes when we hear of attacks against Wagner and Malian forces, we often say it's extremists. We just give everything to extremists, but actually rebels, that is legitimate rebels. And if I say legitimate, these are rebels who are not extremists and who have been fighting for the autonomy and sometimes independence of northern Mali and who have been there for a long time. In 2011 and 2012, their efforts were hijacked by extremists, amongst them, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, formerly from Algeria. But currently, they seem to have resuscitated their rebellion, and it looks like, this is not officially confirmed, but it looks like they are getting some external support in this new offensive. And so far, they have been on the offensive and very effective. But it looks like the extremists are even doing more in terms of the damage they are causing the Malian forces and Wagner. And even yesterday, they were able to attack central Mali, take over military airport, and attack a military training base in central Mali, Bamako, the capital of Mali. I think about a year and a half ago, I mentioned that it is possible for extremists to reach Bamako, and I receive a lot of backlash. It's usual with our job. People will say, no, that is impossible. Malian forces are capable. Wagner, Russia is there. But yesterday we saw it. And in fact, it is sad that people have to die. But sometimes there are a lot of things that could have been done to avoid it. But that's the conversation. Goes on. We come to talk about all this. But as you asked, yes, Wagner and Malian forces are on the defensive, with extremists and rebels on the offensive, and it is not looking good at all for both. For both the Malian forces and Wagner. Yeah.
Let's stay on the geopolitical side of things. So you mentioned something which you didn't say explicitly, but I think there's evidence for that. You mentioned something about external support to. So I think what you're referring to is like the Tuareg rebel group. And they collaborated with Al-Qaeda and is it JNIM or Nusra to attack Wagner group. And yes,
so
you were going to say
that's not what I was referring to. It's more of external state actors. In recent time, Ukraine.
That's what I was gonna say. So there's been news, or Ukraine has come out to acknowledge limited support to these rebels, or so do we see. Also, I've seen as well in Sudan, there's also been some level of Ukraine-Russia fights playing out on the African continent. So do we see a wider, so what I'm seeing, what I believe, I don't know if you agree with me, that the Russia-Ukraine war is just beyond Russia-Ukraine war. It could be a geopolitical kind of competition that is playing out in the continent. Do you see that with this thing going on in the Sahel?
Let me put this in context. Not long ago, Israel carried out an operation in Iran. And Israel, what Israel did was to kill the Hamas leader, political leader in Iran. Now, that is an act of war. To assassinate someone who is a guest to another country in that country is an act of war. So Israel officially denied that. So as we speak, Israel accepted that they killed some Hamas leaders in Lebanon because they are in confrontation with Hezbollah in Lebanon. That is official. But in the case of Iran, where there's no official war, Israel denies it. And so you cannot officially engage them when it comes to the killing of the Hamas leader in Tehran. However, when it came to the ones in Lebanon, they clearly come out, so you could engage them on that. This is to say that, in fact, Ukraine has officially denied granting such help in Mali. I am a security analyst, and I will not just swallow that hook, line, sinker, that because Ukraine is denying it, nothing like that has happened. Even in Sudan, Ukraine maintains this strategic ambiguity. I will not accept, neither will I deny, and then you cannot engage them. So that is what is happening. But in fact, if you put me on the spot and you ask me, do I think that Ukraine will have something to be doing in Africa? I would say yes. And this is the reason. Reason is, one, on the diplomatic side, which is more overt or clear, open, we see Ukraine making effort diplomatically in Africa. They've seen that you have a continent with the largest number of countries. The highest number of countries, 54 countries. And Russia seemed to be doing very well on the continent, diplomatically. And so the diplomatic support you have in Africa is very significant to actually show off in international fora like the UN and other places. So Ukraine has recognized this and ramped up its effort towards gaining the diplomatic support of African states. And that is very significant. So that diplomatic effort will not go alone. It will come with some security backing. And so if I know that I'm not going to get Ukraine knows that they are not going to get the support of Bamako diplomatically. They also know they are not going to get that from Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. And so what Ukraine is doing is that, well, perhaps if other actors are in charge of Bamako, I might get their diplomatic support. This is how this is just part of the game. And so, which is costing life and it's sad, but it's part of the politics. So then Ukraine will see the rebels in northern Mali as viable option to grant support. Because as I mentioned months back, it is possible for Bamako to be run over by rebels. It is possible. It is highly possible. I mentioned this at a time when the rebels were not even close to central Mali. But you see, just like the Taliban were in the wilderness for 20 years and were able to take Kabul 3 years ago, similar things could happen, or the same thing can happen in Mali and other places. And people should watch out. It's very bad, but so that is why the juntas and others need the cooperation of the rest of West Africa to address these security challenges. Going solo, you don't help you because Russia itself has a lot on its hands that is supposed to solve. That it's becoming difficult. So in Sudan, as you mentioned, we also saw that the use of drones and things like that. So wherever Russia will show interest in Africa, Ukraine could counter it militarily or in a more covert means. About 2 days ago, Ukraine actually bombed a base in Syria that belongs to Russia, where Russia is known to be producing some missiles or some arms or drones, armed drones. They bombed it in Syria. But Syria is not part of the Russian-Ukraine war, technically. So I see a lot happening, and Africa is not going to be left out of what is happening in Eastern Europe, and specifically the Ukraine war.
It's very interesting because we see some will say that there is a World War III, which I want to think it does look like it, and it does look like, because again you're looking at how Ukraine is asking for long-range missiles to be able to, and how the West is reluctant, and how Russia is saying, Ukraine is being used proper by the West. So this is basically NATO against East and West versus West. That's what this looks like, and it does remind again of the during the Cold War and all of the proxy wars. So look, as Africa is being co-opted into this war in some way. So what I want to know is this: we've been seeing that Africa plays a big role, and now we see how the superpowers, even medium powers, are caught in Africa's, like you rightly mentioned, in the UN, in those kind of fora. Africa has such leverage, and recently they've been asking for permanent seats in the UN. But it does seem, again, from this perspective that we're talking about, that it is the Russia-Ukraine dynamics is I wouldn't say causing conflict, but making existing conflicts to escalate this conflict or to entrench this conflict more and creating more insecurity in these places. But how? So the question I want to ask is, what is the complicity of the African leaders or this African contact government? Are they just like a pawn, or do they play a deliberate role in all of this that is going on?
Yeah. In my talk about my talks about African leaders, I have always said that when you come to Africa, you should always separate the people from the government. Where you are lucky to find the interest of the people merging with that of the government, then so be it. But mostly, what the people and their feelings are, as opposed to others, are always different, almost always different. And so the government will be pursuing something, and the people, and this is what I'm trying to say about the complicity. Now we have regimes in Africa who are focused on protecting their survival or their stay in office. In the current scheme of things, the juntas in the Sahel are among these groups. The Captain Touare of Burkina Faso wants to remain in office. Assimi Goïta of Mali wants to be in office, remain there. And then Niger, General Tiani also want to be in office, want to remain there. So, and then Chad, Mahamat, after this election that was not so transparent, wants to remain in office. Now, with that, it means these governments are going to engage actors that keeps them in office. So when the actors are coming in, it does not matter what they are going to do within the country, whether it's going to be in near the long-term benefit of the people. That is not what matters. What matters is how they keep the regimes in office, unfortunately. And as I'm saying, if that coincides with the interest of the people, then so be it. But in Africa, as I said, regime protection does not necessarily mean protection of the people. And that is how come in Mali, Wagner resorted to scorched earth approach in fighting terrorism, where they go there and kill, they enter communities and indiscriminately shoot people, to the extent that it was so bad that UN had to come out with a report on that. And so when that happens, then it means that that terrorism, the fight against terrorism, was not effective. And this is what has worsened extremism in Mali. This is what is putting the wind in the sail, because the locals in the north and the central are cooperating with extremists. Because Wagner does not have any experience in this kind of counter-terrorism in the Sahel. They don't have any experience. Wagner doesn't. Wagner is more about engaging in open warfare and engaging in some kind of economic, political operations. That is what it's good at. But when it comes to fighting terrorism, it doesn't. So Wagner was in Mali to protect the regime and not to fight terrorism. And when they attempted fighting terrorism, they made it worse. That is what is happening. And so the complicity of government is that where the interest of government differs with the people or the states, it is always the case that government has become complicit in what is happening. And by extension, they open themselves to be pawns or puppets of global powers. So if Wagner is giving you protection, then you must know to everything that Moscow may say to you. If you are so ineffective that China must give you protection, then you must know to whatever Beijing says. If it is you are so ineffective that the US must come to give you protection, then you must go to Washington's says. Washington says. But you see, this is where the nuances are. The US security presence in Africa seems to be more focused on US security interests than regime protection. For instance, the US bases in Niger, while it protected to some extent the national interest, the national security of Niger, it was more to prevent the creation of safe havens for terrorists to plan attacks against US interests beyond Africa. So in that case, whatever happens with the regime, the US cannot interfere. And that is how come, even though US forces were in Niger during the coup, the US forces could not do anything about it. But currently, the regime there, the coup makers who are in place, want security partners that protects them, and not the one that behave like the US, who is using drones to check extremism and all that. No, they want someone who protect them, and that's the difference between the old regime, democratic regime of Niger, and the current one. And that is how come the current regime did not want US presence, because you're going to talk about democracy. You're going to talk about human rights. You're going to talk. No, they don't want to listen to that. If you're talking about protecting them so that they stayed in office, that is it. Because in Africa, whenever a coup is successful, the first policy is to keep it protected, because other people within the military are planning a counter coup. And that is so in Burkina Faso, we've had several of these coups. And so this all makes government vulnerable to fall for this great war competition that is happening around the world. And that is slowly or even dramatically drawing Africa to global competition. And once again, I mentioned some time ago that in the event of a global war, Africa could be a target. And that too, I had people coming to say, well, Africa is not that, it's not that. But see, look at Djibouti. Djibouti, a small country, has a US naval base, a Chinese naval base, a French naval base, an Italian naval base, and other bases are still springing up. Now, in the event of war, look at the strategic location of Djibouti around the Red Sea corridor of international trade routes. The first thing one of these powers could do is to attack the other on its soil, the Djibouti soil. And it could be very disastrous for Africa. And so that is the thing.
Very interesting. You mentioned Djibouti, because we did private meeting or conference some months ago looking at Chinese military basing in Africa and all of that. But another place again, maybe I don't know if you've taken notice, is Congo. There's also great power competition in Congo among the US and Chinese. So I agree with your assessment that Africa is not just Africa would be could be a direct target if there is an all-out war, this great power competition. But there's something important you mentioned. I would say, whoever, like they say whoever pays you dictates. And you say, when the US were there, you kowtow to if it's Chinese, you kowtow to Beijing. If you see, recently we had the Chinese Africa Summit where Africans are going over there. Now, I want to relate that to what you said previously as well, in terms of we saw the Free Kunta government in regime in Sahel forming an alliance of Sahel states, and you said previously that they would need the African other Africans. So basically, I'm thinking you're talking about ECOWAS. I'm recently seeing Nigeria and Niger forming like a security part. So with Russia withdrawal, do you see the alliance of Sahel state, this regime, do you see them retracing their steps? Do you see them repairing relationship ECOWAS and coming back to the fold? What do you see? What can you project?
Yeah. I remain cautious. However, the inevitable thing is that when your guardian is on the back foot in Europe, definitely you would have to make amends. That amendment or that change in behavior will not come with ease, because then you have become so arrogant, or you have become so obstinate that you coming back will not be easy. Recently, we heard that they are doing a common passport with different biometric features and all that. I mean, these are all part of the politics. But I have said this, and I repeat what I'm saying, that the main goal of these regimes are to become civilian leaders. All these military guys want to become civilian leaders by voting, by going through some process, being part of the transition. That is what ECOWAS protocol frowns upon. That if you stage a coup, you cannot be part of the transition. Like, you can supervise the transition, but you cannot benefit from the transition if you stage the coup. So then that is why they want to move away from ECOWAS. And one of their main goal is that after leaving ECOWAS, if they are able to hold some kind of elections and they become civilian leaders, they will come back. By which time they had already bypassed the ECOWAS protocol that prevents them from benefiting from a transition. That is what they are doing. And that is what they are doing. And then when they are granted, I mean, I've said it, we all live to see. You grant them that kind of, they want to move away, create that, and come back to negotiate. These are three landlocked countries. They don't have access to the coast. They need the rest of coastal African states. We know. These are countries that, despite the huge resources, are economically small. The sizes of their economies are not that big, even though they have potential in the coming decades because of the uranium and the oil and other resources buried in the soil. But currently, they are vulnerable. So they would want to, toe that line. But the security accord between Niger and Nigeria is signaling what Niger may see. In fact, from the word go, I have seen that Niger is trying to be a little different from its colleagues in Burkina Faso and Mali, because the domestic dynamics are different. Because Niger has this giant neighbor, Nigeria, that it cannot do away with. Nigeria is so significant to Niger that I knew that over time they would have to capitulate. Just that, they will not just give up power, but they would want to deal with Nigeria. That is the largest economy in the continent. Except that recent projections put South Africa a little ahead. But Nigeria is, we see where Nigeria is headed. It's a huge economy you cannot do without. And the generals in Niamey are aware of it. Again, if you look at the rank of the military leaders, if you look at the Niger, you see that generals are in charge in Niger. But if you move to Burkina Faso, you see captains. These are junior officers. And then we find the middle rank, that is colonels, in Mali. Now, the paranoia with the captains and the middle ranks are very high. Because then you think that there are seniors who are also willing to take power and kind of maneuverings behind the scenes. But in Niger, the generals are really in charge. And it's like we still have the elites among the military in charge. And they are more likely to be reasonable than the junior officers in Mali and Burkina Faso. That is the other dynamics that people are not really looking at. And so this accord between Abuja and Niamey is not unexpected, and it is not surprising, because generals are more likely, because of the experience they've had over the time, are more likely to be amenable than the junior ranks, who feel so insecure and are always preempting something in order to look like they are the messiahs of the system. So I see slowly And one other factor is that if what happened yesterday in Bamako continues, terrorists attacking and extremists attacking, Mali may have no option than to ask for help from the rest of ECOWAS. Again, the mediator between Sahel, junta-led states, and the rest of ECOWAS, that is Bassirou Faye, that is the Senegalese, has mentioned that the security destinies of Europe and West Africa are linked. He mentioned that. And this is a leader who is seen to be a leftist and radical. And he mentioned that. This shows that perhaps there are signals coming from Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako that perhaps they have to take a second look about European security partnership. And that could be interesting in the coming weeks.
Yes, that's very interesting. That's what I was going to talk about. So we're seeing, we can clearly see, even a blind man can see that the geopolitical competition between the West, Russia, and on the low, not so in our face with China. But we've seen, apart from even the Sahel, we could look at other places like Central African Republic. We see other places where Russia, Libya has been. Now, with this Russia-Ukraine stuff going on, what is going to be the implication of Russia's place? Because again, we can't rule out the fact that the West, which have been the longest or the longer, if you're comparing to external partners or in these places, have not been able to, let's not forget that, also secure these places. So it's just between how am I going to put it? So what I'm just trying to say, there might be the better option compared, but nonetheless, they weren't able to secure this place. So what do you think Africa should be looking to in terms of, are we going to say, oh, is Africa going to say, are this place is going to say, oh, we're on our knees now? We come back, to an ex-lover and say, oh, I'm sorry, now I've gone with this person and I know your importance. Is that the Africa has to be on his knees to do that, or does Africa still has that leverage to think about, take charge of his own destiny?
I will never advise, if I made an advisor to any leader in Africa, I will never advise that you go on your knees and ask for anything from anybody. I will ask that you leverage your strength and what you have in order to attract the people back, no matter how embarrassing it could be that you have to take your word back. Now, if it's about what the Senegalese president said, the security of these two regions are linked, and this is the reason. You are dealing with migration in Southern Europe, and the people who get to the Mediterranean coast to cross onwards to Europe are from West Africa. Most of them are from West Africa. And so you don't have any option than to deal with them. So it doesn't matter whether you were driven away, you still need West Africa anyway. So it's not a matter of one master who doesn't have any problem somewhere and you are the servant and you have a problem and so you were stubborn and you have to come back and beg. No. The master or whoever that we are talking about in Europe has bigger problems, and that is migration, this illegal migration and human trafficking. And the fact that their shores are awash in migrants, that is becoming a problem. And that is even threatening the unity of the European Union. So they also need, and any talk, they must sit and say that, well, maybe in your first coming, as far as this security issue is concerned, you were not this effective. We wanted you to do so and so. So perhaps your mandate has to be redefined as you come back. But I always say that I believe in comparative politics. When these European forces and West African forces and other UN forces were there, as opposed to currently, would any person would choose the former? Because, well, the extremists were on course, because you see, I have an article, a peer-reviewed article, that understanding terrorism in West Africa. And I mentioned that in West Africa, the terrorism that we have is homebred. The people are ethnic groups and homebred, and the issue is homebred that has taken the coloration of global terrorism. So these are people who know the terrain. They didn't come from Syria to establish JNIM in Mali. It's homegrown. Just that they decided to, give their allegiance to Al Qaeda and ISIS. That's what makes the difference. So they know the terrain. So any force that fights this kind of terrorism will find it difficult to succeed, or will find a lot of hurdles to overcome before you can really have something. So whatever the case was, it was natural, because these guys are not going to give up. And that was the main reason why that as part of Operation Barkhane, Mali's government was supposed to negotiate with the moderates among the Tuaregs. So when you got the moderates in the political system, or you regularize the moderates, then you have separated them from the extremists. So you get the moderates on your side to fight the extremists, which is easier. But you don't move from all the way from the south and pretend to be the master in the north. Northern Mali alone is bigger than France, and France is the biggest country in Western Europe. So we are dealing with a huge territory. You can decide to fly 1,000 drones a day, and you will not be able to cover everywhere, to see everywhere. This is a very harsh terrain, arid and semi-arid terrain. Drones have their limitations in this terrain. So every force, no matter how sophisticated you are going to have limitations as to how effective it could be. So it takes time and consistent strategy to achieve results. But currently, Wagner itself wants to go and protect its mother country. And so what do? You are left to yourself. And it could be very disastrous. I mean, it's sad. It's sad. At least, what about your African? In fact, you've driven away the Europeans, fine. Europeans will always have issues in Africa because they colonized Africa. They exploited us. And that is not debatable. It's a matter of fact. So they always have issues, fine. What about your fellow West Africans? And currently, the argument is that West Africa, ECOWAS, is a creation of the European colonialists. And I look at the creation of ECOWAS way back in 1975, when actually military leaders were the founders of ECOWAS. General Yakubu Gowon, Ayedema of Togo, Ghana's a champion. And at the time of ECOWAS, most of the leaders were military leaders. And they were also anti-colonial. But currently, the narrative is that ECOWAS is even the creation of the West. And people are falling for this. And it's the new, there is a propaganda that is reigning. And sometimes you find generals, retired generals. I've dealt with retired generals who believe in this, excuse me to say, nonsense.
Yeah.
You see,
I agree with you.
There are people who are actually suffering because we are unable to stop these extremists. And the sad thing is that the Wagner that was invited to help fight this, the main goal was to protect the regime, but eventually they started fighting extremism, because if you were protecting the regime, you automatically fight terrorism, which you are not ready for. So they engage in indiscriminate killing, extrajudicial killings.
Let's come to a conclusion and take a very broad look in protection. I'm glad that you mentioned, civilians that are caught in the crosshair of all of these dynamics. And look at also propaganda, look at the narratives that have been thrown around. You look at also other kind of approaches, like maybe benefiting from moderates into negotiation. That's like looking at them, how you can bring moderates into the politics, negotiation, and all of that. So if you project and look at, how do you see all of this panning out, with Russia withdrawing, having to, of course, protect its own motherland, with Africa withdrawing, with the West not having not so good relationship with Africa, this region, and also with the rupture with ECOWAS. What do you see projecting, let's say in the short term and the medium term and the long term? Also the dynamics of also sponsoring rebels to fight, because if I remember in the Taliban's as well in Afghanistan, where they were being funded by the America at one point to fight this, and then once that finished, they became the new terror. So it looks like it's a cycle that we're creating, and we keep doing repeating the same thing. So what do you see moving forward in the short, medium, and to conclude with short, medium, and long term?
In the short term, things are going to get worse because it's not easy to swallow your pride and admit that your decisions did not work. So in the Sahel, the leaders are going to engage in this kind of matricism and trying to tell the story that they are still in charge and all that. We see that terrorists have taken strategic towns and they are moving towards Ouagadougou. It's serious. We've seen Bamako yesterday. Niamey is relatively okay, but we've also found some rebels in Niger, especially after the coup, because then these guys were part of a peace process that brought the whole country together. And now that there's a coup, it means that peace process automatically collapses because the kind of constitution that's safeguarded that peace process is overthrown. With that, you are not going to, as I said, you're not going to have an overnight wonder. So in the short term, things are going to get really rough before they get better. In the medium term, I see some kind of tables being created so that people sit around to negotiate, find common grounds in the medium term. And the step by Niger shows that, well, we might have formed the AES and what have you, but we have unique needs. And Niger has shown that way. And despite everything, the generals or the soldiers in Ouagadougou and Bamako have taken that signal from Niger that, well, we may be united or we may have created a political union, so-called, but we have different needs. With that long border with Nigeria, the giants in West Africa and even Africa, you cannot pretend that they do not exist. You would So in the medium term, I see some sitting around. In the long term, however, it's going to get more complex because it looks like the outcome of Ukraine, if there is some surprise negotiation in Ukraine or some peace in Ukraine, then Russia will have free hand to revamp its interest in Africa. So it means that all the forces that are being redeployed would have to come back to Africa and ensure that the gold and the resources that Russia needs is being funneled. So a lot will also depend on what happens in Eastern Europe. Again, we also see the US elections will also say something about how the West react. If Trump wins, I don't see US packing bag and baggage to leave Africa as a whole, but Africa will not be a priority. But, about 2 years ago, when Biden never stepped in Africa, he never paid Africa, but he made his vice president do it. And somehow, the vice president is currently the candidate. If she wins, it's more likely for us to be a priority, not because she is Black, but because Biden delegated the prioritization of Africa to her in a kind of tour that she embarked on. She came to Ghana, she went to other countries. So then that is in the short term because the elections are just months away. And so if that happens, America is likely to double down on its renewed interest in Africa. And that can spook other powers to either do more or withdraw where they cannot match the resources and the interest of the US. So, but in the long term, I see Africa taking sides. Some countries will shift more, on paper, we seem to be neutral, but I see some countries tilting more westward and others more eastward. And unfortunately, it looks like you can tell those who can tilt eastward and those who can tilt westward. And it's so unfortunate that it's like that, but that is the reality. and I'm so optimistic about the continent. Yes.
Okay, I'm optimistic as well, because in the midst of all of this, you can see that all of the dynamics, you can see clearly that Africa has the leverage. Africa has positives. They have what they can negotiate with. If only they can have visionary leaders and all that. But Fidel, it's always a pleasure to have you. Your insights are always very rich and nuanced, and we're very grateful to have you once again. And thank you very much. Once this is published, we'll be grateful if you could help spread this right, because last time you didn't. So we'll be grateful so that this can reach the people that need to hear this and do the needful. But we're very, very grateful, and I'll keep in touch. I'll text as well regarding the other episode on the Ghana stuff, and see your recommendations, so we can. That's another vital episode to do, because Ghana is very strategic, because it's been a very stable democracy. So we don't want
no. On my part, I think that nothing dramatic would happen, but I think the EC must up its game. I mean, there's a lot going on that is not that has been unprecedented. Party apparatchiks being appointed to the board at the EC chairmanship and things like that. So things have not been too good, but and it looks like because of the current economic problems, the opposition has a better chance in the next elections, and that is not sitting so well with the ruling government. And because of that, because of that, the kind of there's this kind of tension, and then open threat of manipulating the elections. I mean, if the field left, there's a level playing field for the various or the many parties, things will be fine. I mean, the government has slim chance of winning this election, but I mean, what's democracy about? This is a president who lost the election and is coming back. He conceded and left. So what is wrong?
Okay, we would see. We will see that in the next episode. Thank you very much, Fidel. All right, I'll let you have a great day, and I'll see you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. All right. Bye.
Thank you once again for tuning into today's episode with Fidel Owusu, who is joining us for the second time. Fidel, is giving an amazing insight into the Russian withdrawal from the Sahel and the broader, wider implications on the continent. Thank you once again. Join me as usual to thank Fidel, and I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Follow us, follow on the pages, like, and stay tuned for the next episode. See you.